Hello, everybody. Welcome to another live stream for the History Valley podcast. Today, Dr. Bartosz Adamczewski joins us, and we're going to be resuming our conversation on Matthew's use of Luke and Mark, as opposed to Luke's use of Matthew and Mark. So welcome back to History Valley, Doctor.
Welcome to everyone. I'm really glad to be with you.
Let's start looking at these slides. So the material in this video uses both of these books, Q or Not Q, and his other book, The Gospel of Matthew, a hypertextual commentary. The links you can see right there on the screen on the far right to purchase these books. The links are also in the description below, so you can go down there as well. Okay, so posteriority derives from posterior, meaning coming after in time or later. It posits Matthew's use of Luke, Acts, and Mark, as opposed to Luke's use of Matthew and Mark in the Farrer hypothesis. You can see in the diagram on the right there. And it also denies the existence of the Q document, which has that in common with the Farrer theory. And the key points are that Luke's knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls is greater than that of Matthew's. Therefore, Luke was written earlier in time than Matthew, and Matthew is aware of Bar Kokhba era events, such as the construction of something in the way of the Second Temple, that's Aelia Capitolina. Matthew's double tradition material is more primitive than Luke's. It's more advanced than Luke, I meant to write. Matthew's material is more advanced than Luke, as even admitted by scholars that say that that Matthew made use of Mark and that Luke used Matthew and Mark, which is quite strange if Luke is supposed to be written later than Matthew. Why is his double tradition material more primitive? Anyway, I actually just made the correction there. So Matthew's more advanced than Luke in his double tradition. All right, so Bartosz, tell us what's going on here with this date of composition. What led you to the conclusion that the Gospels made use of Josephus and date to the 2nd century?
Yeah, I think that this is more and more widely recognized fact in the analysis of the Gospels. I mean, in all the synoptic Gospels and also of the Gospel of John, that they were written quite late. The former consensus was that they were written in the second half of the 1st century. Usually people dated the Gospel of Mark after the Jewish War, so sometime after the year 70, and the Gospels of Matthew and Luke somewhat later, in the 80s of the 1st century, and the Gospel of John somewhat later, by the end of the 1st century. The view change with the realization of the fact that the Gospel writers, the evangelists, knew and creatively used the works of Josephus, including the Jewish antiquities. And this work, Josephus' Jewish antiquities, is dated to 93 after Christ. In fact, this is our really one and unique point which is useful for dating New Testament texts. Everything else is more or less guessing by seeing some resemblances between the text and the historical events, for example, as we do in dating of the Book of Revelation and so on and so on. So everything else, including the event that will be described here, is more or less tentative. But here, the fact that the evangelists, Mark, Luke, Matthew, and John, used the works of Josephus, including the Antiquities, which is dated to 93 after Christ, means that all Gospels, all 4 Gospels, canonical Gospels that we have, were written in the 2nd century. The second factor, which is important here, is the papyrological dating of the Gospels. formerly scholars dated the Gospels to the second half of the first century, because the earliest manuscripts that contains a fragment of the Gospel of John, so-called P52, was dated to 125 after Christ. Now, if you follow the most recent papyrological research on this papyrus, especially the articles by Pasquale Orsini and Willy Clarisse, also recent articles by Brent Thongbrey from Norway, we can see that this manuscript, this papyrus, is dated to the second half of the second century, or even the first half of the third century. So we do not have this terminus antequem, the time before which the Gospels must have been written, in the date of the papyrus. So the former dating of the papyrus P52, which set the date before which the Gospels must have been written, from, as it was formerly thought, 125 to even the beginning of the third century, now leaves the room in the second century for the Gospels to have been written. So we have a significant change in these two factors, both the use of Josephus and also the dating of the New Testament papyri, which now change the view concerning the date of composition of all the Gospels. Now I speak generally about all the Gospels. Okay, now if we come to the Gospel of Matthew, as I argue, the Gospel of Matthew was written later than the Gospel of Mark, and everyone agrees with it. Almost everyone agrees with it. So if the Gospel of Mark was written after the works of Josephus, so sometime at the beginning of the second century, the Gospel of Matthew must have been written later. So we know it now from Mark's use of Josephus. Moreover, if Matthew used Luke, and we know it's almost sure today, following the works of Steve Mason, for example, that Luke also knew and used Josephus' works, then the Gospel of Matthew is even later than both Mark and Luke. If we date the Gospel of Mark to the beginning of the second century, the Gospel of Luke to, say, 120, 130, then we have the Gospel of Matthew dated to around 140, 150 AD. Which is also important. Now we have the context of Marcion and his activity in Rome. Marcion came to Rome, if we can date this event, around 144 after Christ. So it seems that his protest against Judaizing the Gospel of Mark in the Gospel of Luke met the reaction of the Gospel of Matthew. So it seems to me, at least, and also to other scholars, that the Gospel of Matthew is a kind of reaction to the activity of Marcion. So if this is true, then we have the Gospel of Matthew dated after the protest of Marcion, so around 145, 150. On the other hand, the Gospel of Matthew should be earlier than Justin, the apologist, and his apology is dated to 153. So we have a narrow span for dating the Gospel of Matthew, around 145 and 150. So this is the dating of the Gospel by comparing it with other literary works. As you ask here about the date for the Gospel, it's also probable, but I wouldn't put much weight on it, that the allusion that we find in the Gospel of Matthew concerning the presence of the abomination of desolation in the holy place and the topohagio, which almost certainly denotes the Jerusalem temple, then we could have here an allusion to the construction of a pagan statue or something later pagan sanctuary in the place of the Jerusalem temple, which happened at the time of Hadrian after the Bar Kokhba revolt.
I find that
Probably
to
this
be
event triggered the Bar Kokhba
I
revolt.
find that to be very interesting because when I heard you say that to me several interviews back, the gospel I went back and reread Mark's version of the abomination, Luke's version, and Matthew's version. Mark has the abomination standing somewhere, but not in the place of the holy place. Luke's version of it's very different, doesn't even have anything close to what Matthew says. And then Matthew goes out of its way to be different from both of them and say, now it's standing in the way of the holy place. I find that just absolutely fascinating. Would you say, would you apply that as evidence that Matthew's later than Luke because Matthew seems to be aware of events happening later and Mark and Luke are not aware of?
For me, the Marcan version of the saying is a literary allusion. It's an allusion to the text of Daniel. So it's clear that it's only a literary allusion. So I think that Mark was written before the Bar Kokhba revolt, or at least he does not allude to this abomination of desolation, which for every Jew meant the pagan, something pagan in Jerusalem. But Matthew makes it explicit that this abomination of desolation does not stand somewhere which it should not stand, but it stands in the holy place and the topos, which means topos makom in Hebrew, and also in the whole Old Testament means topos, which means the place, the holy place of the sanctuary. So I think that Matthew is aware of this conflict of the presence of a pagan element, say vaguely. I don't want to say that it was already the whole pagan temple erected there, but at least a pagan element standing in the holy place of the temple of Jerusalem. Before the Bar Kokhba revolt, after the destruction of the Jerusalem temple in the year 70, there was nothing there. It was only at the time of Hadrian in 2nd century, around 132, that Hadrian had this idea of making Jerusalem a Roman Hellenistic city, Aelia Capitoline. So I'm not sure whether this triggered the revolt or it was the result of the revolt. In any case, we have here a great conflict for the Jews. It was really an abomination for the Jews to have a pagan element in the holy place of the Temple of Jerusalem. And I think that Matthew here alludes to it because the Jews were so sensitive to the presence of something, pagan in the holy place that it must have triggered some reactions from the part of the Jews. And I think that Matthew alludes to these reactions.
Let's take a look at this super chat from Benjamin Love. Thank you for your super chat, Benjamin. Perhaps I'm confused, but you said Luke's knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Sorry for the sarcasm, but the DSS were discovered at Qumran in 1946. Can your perspective on this? He then corrected his phrase in another chat and said, I meant to say, can you explain your perspective on this?
Yeah, I don't mean Luke's knowledge of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's a shortened. I don't mean that he knew the scrolls themselves. I mean that he knew the texts that are contained in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we know that these texts, at least some of them, were known not only from the Qumran desert. For example, the famous Damascus document was known from Cairo. It was first known from Cairo, Geniza. It was found in the family from 1905 or something like this at the beginning of the 20th century in Cairo, in Egypt. And now we have several copies of this important document among the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I don't mean that Luke knew the manuscripts that are today contained in the Museum of Israel in Jerusalem. I mean that he knew the texts. Moreover, these texts are also partly preserved in the Apocrypha. For example, I argue that Luke knew and extensively used the so-called Apocalypse of Weeks, which is found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. You may find it among the text there, 4Q 242. We have fragments of this work among the Dead Sea Scrolls, among the texts that are known from the Dead Sea Scrolls. But another version of it, in fact, we could say spoiled version of it, is contained in the Enoch corpus, which we know from Ethiopia. So these texts circulated. They have been found at Qumran, in the Qumran desert in Judea, but they also circulated somewhere else. They could be found in Egypt, in Ethiopia, and so on. So they circulated among the Jews, not only in Palestine. And I think that Luke knew them and used them, the texts that circulated there.
Okay, let's take a look at the slides again. A lot of scholars will say that, well, Papias is the reason that, well, not the reason, but one of the reasons they put the Gospels in the first century, because they think he wrote around AD 110. Some even put him as early as 100. Some even put him earlier in the 90s AD. And they say this is a patristic source that is aware of the Gospels. What do you think about this?
We have great problems with dating these patristic texts. We have problems not only with dating the so-called fragments, say, of Papias, who is otherwise unknown, except from the writings of Eusebius from the 4th century, who quotes Papias. We have the same problem with Ignatius of Antioch. We were usually taught, because of Eusebius, that he wrote his letters at the beginning of the 2nd century. Now, if you ask patristic scholars, they will greatly hesitate, most of them, to date the epistles of Ignatius of Antioch such early to the beginning of the 2nd century. So we have problems with dating these patristic texts because they are only dated on the basis of Eusebius' mentioning of them and the dates that were assigned to them by Eusebius. But Eusebius lived in the 4th century, so say 300 years later than these texts apparently were apparently composed. So if we trust Eusebius, then we have these dates. But it's difficult to trust Eusebius in everything that he quotes or gives in his work. He wants to have a historical, say, outline of the history of early Christianity. It does not mean that what he says is always accurate. So the texts that are assigned to or attributed to Papias in Eusebius' writings come from some source, probably. I don't think that Eusebius simply invented them. But the dates that are given by Eusebius are not necessarily true.
You don't just have Luke using the text found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but you also made mention that Mark also used the Damascus document, particularly that story in 4Q 271 about no one should open a sealed vessel on the Sabbath. No one should carry medicine on his person, either going out or coming in on the Sabbath. No one should pick up stone and dust in an inhabited place. No caregiver should carry a baby on the Sabbath. Either going out or coming in, no one should provoke his servant, his maid, or his employee on the Sabbath. So, go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. So this whole halakhic discussion, halakha means a legal interpretation of the Torah, of the Pentateuch, can be found in many works that have been found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. I think that the Damascus document is one of the most important of them. So I think that such discussions were really widespread, especially among the Pharisees. I recently published an article, All the Dead Sea Scrolls Pharisaic, because I think that the texts that were previously attributed to the Essenes, this attribution is wrong. It simply happened by chance, which is not right in scholarship. We should really analyze their contents. And I think that they were really written, at least the most important of them, by people whom today we would identify as Pharisees. We have some proofs for it. For example, in the use of the phrase erga nomo, works of the law. This phrase can only be found in Paul's writings and previously only in the so-called 4Q MMP. So we have some arguments that these texts are Pharisaic, were Pharisaic. And I think that the gospel writers also knew this fact, that these texts were related to the Pharisees. And when they described the activities and also the views of the Pharisees, they alluded to these documents, 4Q MMP, or for example here, the Damascus document. So I think that especially in the questions concerning Sabbath regulations, as you will know, in the Pentateuch, there is the principle of keeping the Sabbath and so on. But what it meant in practice to keep the Sabbath is not detailed, it's not described in the Pentateuch in a very detailed way. In fact, the whole halacha that arose among this precept of sanctifying the Sabbath, making it holy, and so on, came only later, especially with the Pharisees. Josephus says that they were the most exact ones in the interpretation of the laws. So, in fact, they gave such legal comments on what it meant to keep Sabbath, what could be done and what should be done, what should not be done on the day of the Sabbath. So we have such examples from the Gospel of Matthew and Mark, for example, as plucking the heads of grain and so on. Is it lawful or unlawful on the day of the Sabbath? And the Pharisees reacting to this activity of Jesus' disciples. As concerns the Damascus document, it's especially visible in the Gospel of Luke. With the Gospel of Mark, it's not so obvious, but I think that when it comes to the Gospel of Luke, it becomes even more visible because the contrast between Luke and Mark that parallel the arguments from the Dead Sea Scrolls are really striking. I think that you have here, yes, you have here this fragment here now on the screen. The fact is that if you compare the doublet, the second version of the healing of the man with the withered hand in the Gospel of Luke. So we have two versions of this account in the Gospel of Luke. One of them simply follows the Gospel of Mark. We have a man with a withered hand, which means a dry hand, in the synagogue and so on. So here Luke generally follows the Gospel of Mark. But we have another version of the same story in Luke 14, in which the situation is opposite to the Markan one. Instead of having the man with a withered hand, with a dry hand, we have a man who is hydropikos. It's a medical term for someone with edema. He's full of water. So we have the exact opposite to what was meant in the Gospel of Mark. In the Gospel of Mark, his hand was dry, xeros, like Xerox today, xerography. It was dry. In the Lucan second version of this story, the man is full of water. His body is full of water, so he is like drowned in the body of water. Moreover, the activity of Jesus is quite different from that in the Gospel of Mark. Whereas in the Gospel of Mark, the man simply stretched his hand and the hand was made again, was restored to be healthy. In the Lucan version, in chapter 14, in the second version of this story, we have Jesus strangely catching, grasping the man. For what reason? The man was full of water, and now we have Jesus catching the man, grasping the man. It's unusual for the Gospels. I think it's the only case in the Gospels that Jesus catches someone, grasps someone. So it's really strange. If we compare the second version of the Lucan account of the man with the withered hand, now with the man with drops, with edema, being full of water, hydropikos, and Jesus catching, grasping the man. If we compare this account with the Damascus document, then we have striking parallels. As you have it here, let no one raise up an animal which has fallen into the water on the Sabbath day. But if it is a man who falls into the water on the Sabbath day, one shall sorry, I cannot see it. Maybe I will make it greater. Yes. One shall extend his garment to him to pull him out with it, but he shall not carry an implement to pull him out on the Sabbath day, and so on and so on and so on. So we have here striking parallels to the Damascus document. First, it is now here is the animal, but later it's the man, falls into the body of water, in a pit, in fact, in a pit full of water on the day of the Sabbath. And the question is, are you allowed to rescue such a man? Because the Sabbath principle forbids you. You should not work. On the other hand, there is a man losing his life because he's drowning in water. So the Pharisees, I think that the Pharisees are the authors of this halakha, of this interpretation, made something in between, a middle way. You are forbidden from working on the day of the Sabbath, but on the other hand, there is a man losing his life. So if you only stretch your hand and catch the man with your hand only, you're allowed to do it. But you are not allowed to use any tool, kli, Hebrew. Kli means an instrument, like a garment or ladder or stick or something, because it would mean working for the Pharisees. So we can see Jesus in the Lucan account, in the Lucan version of this account, following the interpretation here given in the Damascus document, that there is a man who is drowning in water, and Jesus grasps the man with his hand only, without using any tool, which means that Jesus follows the Pharisaic, as I argue here, the Pharisaic interpretation of the Sabbath principle, of the Sabbath commandment, that he does what is allowed on the day of the Sabbath. And I think, as I argue here, that Luke knew this version. If you follow the version of Matthew, which we have here in the left column, you can see that Matthew probably did not understand this argument. He said to them, suppose one of you has only one sheep, and it falls into a pit on the Sabbath. Will you not lay hold of it and lift it out? How much more valuable is a human being than the sheep? So it is lawful to do it on the Sabbath. I think that Matthew here really does not understand the argument that was deployed in the Damascus document, because he starts with the sheep. In fact, the problem is not with the sheep. The problem is with saving human life on the day of the Sabbath. Moreover, he does not have this stretching of the hand, this grasping of the man in the body of water. He simply has the problem of saving on the day of the Sabbath and so on. So I think that Matthew here is much more distanced from the argument, the logic of the argument that is deployed in the Damascus document than is Luke. Luke clearly engages with the Pharisaic way of argumentation in the Damascus document, and Matthew simply conflates this argument with one sheep. One sheep, we know it from a parable of the lost sheep elsewhere in the Lucan Gospel in chapter 15. Here we are in chapter 14. So I think that Matthew conflated the two texts. The one, Luke 14, with the saving of the man full of water, with the saving of one sheep, which we know from the famous parable of the lost sheep. and he conflated them into one account, but really losing the force of the argument that was used in the Damascus document. It was very clever for the Pharisees to invent such an argument. If there is someone who loses his life on the day of the Sabbath, you may help him all with your hand only. But if you use a tool, an instrument, you violate the Sabbath law.
Let's take a look at the next diagram, the Matthew conflator hypothesis. In page 25, in your commentary on Matthew, you name several scholars that hold the Matthean posteriority position that think that Matthew did use Mark and Luke, like you do, but they still think that Q existed, including Alan Garu, Martin Hengel, Eric Aurelius, and others. Why did they think? Not why did they think? That's not what I meant to ask. What do you think of this?
I think that it is a relic of the past. If you consider the fact that the two-source document permeates gospel scholarship for 200 years already, it's really difficult to get rid of it because people are so used to it, because people were taught at the universities, in colleges, at the universities, that there was something like a Q source, that it's really difficult to get rid of it. I think that this is really unnecessary. Once we recognize the fact and acknowledge the fact that Matthew really used Luke extensively, then Q is really unnecessary. Some scholars postulate that the existence of some limited Q. I think that Alan Garu postulates the Q source of the amount of around 450 words. It could explain some text in which Matthew is close to Luke. But I think that once we recognize and acknowledge the fact that Matthew used Luke, then Q is really unnecessary. And the price that we pay for the existence of Q is really high. We already discussed it in one of the previous meetings here, that the price is really high. It's easy for scholars to postulate the existence of something, but then prove it somehow. Find me some documents, some manuscripts, some quotations. The Q source cannot be found. Moreover, scholars even disagree on the language in which it was written. Many scholars would like to have it in Hebrew or Aramaic. Others say it is impossible because, for example, the word epiousios, which we have in the Our Father prayer, is only found on the level of Greek. So even such a simple thing like the language of this source or document is really contested. So let's leave other things as well. So it's easy for scholars to postulate something. But again, I say the price for such postulate is really high because we must admit that there was something. It was very important for Matthew and Luke because they both use it. But then what happened to it? Did it simply disappear? Did early Christians simply lost such an important document, which was at the beginning of the gospel tradition? Did they simply throw it away to a recycle bin or lose it somehow? It is impossible from theological grounds, from literary grounds, historical grounds. Moreover, I say that all the evangelists knew Paul's letters because they were known everywhere. If the Q source was known, as were known Paul's letters, the Paul's letters were preserved in manuscript. What about the Q source? Why don't we have any manuscript of them, of the Q source? Why don't we have it in Egypt, for example, among the Oxyrhynchus papyri or other papyri? We do not have it anywhere. So I think that, again, to repeat, it's easy for scholars to postulate something, a lost source, because we got used to it, because this began at the beginning of at the end of the 18th century. with the postulating of the lost tribe of Gospels. You may postulate everything you want, but then again, the price for such postulating is so high that I think that it's much better to get rid of it totally and to explain the text that we have in the manuscripts in some textually differing versions, but then we stand on the firm ground of the manuscripts. We know Mark from the manuscripts, we know Luke from the manuscripts, we know Matthew from the manuscripts, and we have here a firm ground. We may disagree how to interpret, we may disagree how to understand the relationships between them, but at least here we stand on the firm ground. Otherwise, we are in clouds, inventing something new, something lost, and so on and so on. It's unverifiable. I think it's really unscholarly.
So I wanted to show this slide, the abomination of desolation, so the audience can clearly see the difference here of Mark, Luke,
especially Mark and Matthew, the first and the third one.
Yeah.
Mark, when you see the abomination that causes desolation standing where it does not belong, it's quite vague. I think it's simply an allusion to the text of Daniel, a literal allusion. Where it does not belong, it's quite vague somewhere. But in the Matthean version, the bottom one, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation, spoken of through the prophet Daniel, Matthew wants everything to be clearly quoted. Let the reader understand, and we have it here in the holy place, standing in the holy place, not where it does not belong, but in the holy place. And this is an argument for me to date the Gospel of Matthew to the time of Hadrian, around 140 or even later, 145, 50, because as I argued earlier, it also postdates, I think it postdates the protest of Marcion.
Would you say that in itself is also evidence of Matthew's awareness of Mark and Luke, because Matthew's aware of Bar Kokhba era events when Mark and Luke are not? They're not aware that there's something in the way, but Matthew is. That's a question I asked earlier.
It would be a good argument, but this is an argument from silence, argumentum ex silencio. The fact that that Mark does not explicitly allude to the Bar Kokhba revolt, that does not necessarily mean that it was written earlier than the Bar Kokhba revolt. It's simply an argument from silence. I think that he wrote his gospel before the Bar Kokhba revolt, but in fact, such an argument from non-existence of something is rather weak, because non-existence in itself is not a proof. I once studied medicine. If we want to make a test for something, you need two tests to show that something really does not exist. One missing probe tells you nothing. You should make two tests to say that you are not ill or something. One test says nothing. One negative result says nothing. So also here, one negative result that Mark does not refer to the Bar Kokhba revolt does not necessarily mean that Mark was written earlier than the Bar Kokhba revolt. So in itself, it's not a compelling argument.
Matthew 1-2 as a sequential hypertextual reworking of Acts 1:1 to 8:35. So you think that the infancy narrative in Matthew is a modification and enhancement of what's happening in Acts?
Yes, and here we come to the clue end, and this I think really interesting, because we have some general ideas, but we should come to the details. Maybe let's clarify the things at the beginning. The way of reworking that we usually find in the Bible is not necessarily quoting. We have some quotations, and also Matthew likes quoting texts, for example, from various prophets, like we had it here from the prophet Daniel, and so on and so on. So at times, gospel authors and also other writers of the Old Testament and New Testament text refer to earlier texts by quoting them. But I think that this is not the rule. In fact, the Bible, I would say, is a great midrash in itself. So the biblical writers rather preferred to allude to earlier texts in a way which is much more creative than simply quoting, extensively quoting, like copying earlier texts. And this is really fascinating. And this makes up the whole Bible, I would say. That the whole Bible was written both for kids who can understand, simple stories, but also for intelligent people who follow hidden allusions. And I think that the Bible is full of hidden allusions. And we should reckon with this fact in our understanding of the Bible. Because people, the Bible is a text of faith. And this is both good and also it's a scholarly obstacle. It's good because it shows us the way to God, to know God, to the way to salvation. And it's good. On the other hand, people who find in the Bible only the way to God, they only tend to find the general message of the text. What is the message of the Gospel of Matthew? Is it pro-Jewish, anti-Jewish, and so on and so on? But the scriptural authors, the biblical authors, played with the text. For them, texts were really important, and they played with the text, with the minor details of the text, in a very creative way. And this is really, I would say, Jewish, so to say, in the way of Israelite, Semitic, of composing the whole Bible. So this is a good example, the infancy narrative, because here Matthew was free. In other parts of his gospel, he generally followed the Gospel of Mark. In other parts of the gospel, we have this evidence of his use of the Acts of the Apostles in minor changes which he made to the Gospel of Mark. Minor changes, for example, changing a preposition, changing a word from this one to another one, and so on and so on. So in other parts of his Gospel, he used Mark, also Luke, and he adapted his existing sources, extant sources, Mark and Luke, to the particular part of the Acts of the Apostles, which he wanted to illustrate. But here at the beginning, he was free. In composing his infancy narrative, of course, he used the Lucan infancy narrative. So we have the genealogy, for example, which is put elsewhere in the Gospel of Luke. We have the Annunciation story. We have the birth story, and so on and so on. But then he was much more creative in shaping his own infancy narrative, which only generally resembles the infancy narrative from the Gospel of Luke. So now if we come to details, and here you should simply follow my book, my commentary on the Gospel of Matthew, my hypertextual commentary on the Gospel of Matthew. It's difficult to explain now everything in detail. But let's start with from the beginning. How does it begin? How does the Gospel of Matthew begin? It begins in a quite surprising way. Biblos Geneseos Jesu Christu Hiu David Hiu Abraham. Biblos Geneseos, the book of Genesis. We usually translate it an account of the genealogy or the book of genealogy, but Biblos Geneseos is in fact both the name of the book of Genesis, and it's also an allusion to something that's contained in this book, because we have this phrase Biblos Geneseos within the book of Genesis, in Genesis 2:4, in Genesis 5:1, and so on, in the version of the Septuagint. So it's both a reference to the book of Genesis as a whole, and also to some fragments of it. So why do we have here at the beginning of Jesus' life not something that refers to Jesus, but something that refers to the book of Genesis, the first book of the Bible? Matthew comes to Jesus only later, in verse 16 or 17 of his genealogy. So why do we have here a reference to the book of Genesis? I think that because in the Acts of the Apostles, we have a similar beginning of the work of the Acts of the Apostles. Luke does not start his Acts with the history of the church, but with a reference to another text, which he calls ton proton logon, epoiezamen kratis theophil. Protos, in fact, is a superlative. It's difficult to translate into English in a good way. It's the very first. It's not comparative, it's superlative. It's not proteros, the more first, it's superlative, the very first. So the very first book that I made, logos here means a book, a written work. So the very first written work I made my honored Theophilus and so on and so on. So we have at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles a reference to the not simply previous, but the very first book, Protos Logos. And we have something similar here at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, Biblos Genesis, the very first book of the Bible. Of course, Matthew liked, as I argued before, not the Jewish text that can be found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. He liked the canonical text of Scripture, and that is why he alluded to the first canonical book of Scripture, especially of the Pentateuch, to the book of Genesis. Then we have a strange reference to David and then to Abraham, which is strange. Why first David and then Abraham? Normally we would have, and we have it in genealogy, first Abraham and then David. Because if we follow the Acts of the Apostles, here we have, after the remark concerning the very first work that Luke wrote earlier, he has here a reference to the Basileia to Theou, the kingdom of God. And the kingdom of God, the issue of the kingdom, is alluded to by Matthew with the remark concerning David. And only thereafter Abraham, because later we have the promise of the Spirit, and in post-theology, the promise of the Spirit was related to Abraham, to whom the promise was given. So the strange, in effect, order in the Gospel of Matthew, first David and then Abraham, which is strange because it is unhistorical, because Abraham lived earlier than David, and we have in genealogy itself the correct order, first Abraham and then David. It follows the topics, the ideas that are contained in the Acts of the Apostles. So first, the very first book, then the kingdom, and then the promise of the Spirit, which was promised to Abraham. So this is the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. Then we have a very interesting thing, namely in the genealogy. If we follow this genealogy in the Gospel of Matthew, Abraham again doesn't Isaac. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac begot Jacob. Jacob there begot Judah and his brothers. Jacob there again doesn't Judan, Caitus, Adelphus. Here we have something that is striking, because normally we have just one begetting one. Abraham begetting Isaac. Isaac begetting Jacob. Jacob begetting Judah, and it should be all. But now we have a reference to his brothers, which is strange. Why do we have these brothers? They have no part in the genealogy, because Jesus was the son of Judah, the genealogical line. So why these brothers? Because we have a reference to Israel later in the Acts of the Apostles. Moreover, in the list of the Apostles, which is contained somewhat later in the Acts of the Apostles, we have just a moment. We have the last element in the list is Judas Jacobu, Judah of Jacob, and it's only in the Lucan version, or in the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles. So we have an allusion to it here that Jacob begot Judah and also his brothers. The brothers here refer to the whole Israel, the 12 tribes, and we have this idea in the Acts of the Apostles because the apostles here, the list of the apostles, refers to the 12 tribes of Israel. That is why there are 12. And then in the genealogy, we have something which is really striking, and many exegetes wrote extensively on this subject, namely the women. We have 4 women in the genealogy of Jesus. And it is strange. Why do we have these women? Normally we have 1 man begetting 1 man. But here in the Gospel of Matthew, we have 4 women included in the genealogy of Jesus. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and that of Uriah, as she is called here. Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and that of Uriah. Why do we have them? When we go to the Acts of the Apostles, after the list of the apostles, we have the text goes. These all continued with one accord in prayer and supplication with the women, Semginaixin. So we have not only the apostles representing the 12 tribes of Israel, like Judah and his brothers, but we also have women. What women? How many women do we have in Luke's story? We have 4, Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Susanna, and Mary of James, who came to Jerusalem with Jesus and the apostles. So we have 4 women in the Lucan story, both the Gospel and the Acts of the Apostles, and we have 4 women included in the genealogy of Jesus. The last one in the Acts of the Apostles is Mary, the mother of Jesus, because they prayed together with women and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Syn Mariam Temetri to Jesus. And immediately after these women in the genealogy of Jesus, when they end, the genealogy ends not with Joseph, as we could expect. Jacob begat Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom was born Jesus, who is called Christ. So the genealogy surprisingly ends not with Joseph, but with Mary. So she is the most important one here. That of whom exhes agenetha Jesus cholegomenos Christos. By the way, here we have another trace of the use of Josephus, because only Josephus has this phrase, Jesus cholegomenos Christos. We have this in Josephus' reference to James, the Lord's brother, who was the brother of Jesus, who was called Christos, who was called the Messiah. So we have here Matthew evidently quoting Josephus in his description of Jesus as the one legomenos Christos, who was called the Messiah, who was called the Christ. So, such minor elements of the Matthean, say now, genealogy point to various ideas at the beginning of the Acts of the Apostles. They are not borrowed from the Gospel of Mark. They are not Lucan. They are strange, because for 2,000 years, scholars have not adequately explained the presence of women in the genealogy of Jesus, which is otherwise male, and also of the brothers of Judah at the beginning. But we have here an explanation that Matthew simply follows the ideas that are found in the Acts of the Apostles, and then he reworks them creatively in his story. Let's skip a little bit, because other things are also interesting. I mean, the second part of his infancy narrative, namely the Magi coming from the east to Jerusalem. Magi, Gentiles coming from the east to Jerusalem, clearly allude to the Jews who come to Jerusalem on the day of the Pentecost. So we have here the same idea which was found in the Acts of the Apostles. People from various nations, from the east, counted from the east, from Parthians and so on, counting from the east, from Mesopotamia, coming to Jerusalem for the day of the Pentecost and the miracle there. And we have the same idea reworked in Matthew with Magi, who come from the east or Anatolon to Judea, and they meet King Herod and so on and so on. So again, we can enter here into details if we have some time. I don't know whether we still have some time to see the details, because it's not only the general idea that these Magi from the east somehow illustrate the people counted from the east who come to Jerusalem on the day of the Pentecost, but really sentence after sentence is a reworking of the elements that can be found in the Acts of the Apostles. I think it's really interesting and it's really important. Just one thing that can be interesting to the readers, to our audience, to the participants of this podcast here. The strange behavior of the star. If you read carefully the Matthean account, it's really strange what happens to the star. Because at the beginning they state that they have seen the star ente Anatole, which means either a rising star or a star in the east. Here the text is ambiguous. Nevertheless, they have seen a celestial phenomenon, an astrological phenomenon. But then they come to Jerusalem, and now something strange happens to this star. Namely, the star goes before them. It's now a moving star. At the beginning, it was an astrological phenomenon, like conjunction with of Saturn and Mars or something. But here we have the star moving. So from a simple star, it becomes like a comet or something which precedes the Magi and goes before them to Bethlehem, which is strange. The change of the behavior of the star. But if we follow the account of the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 2 as well, because chapter 2 of the Gospel of Matthew is generally the working of chapter 2 of the Gospel of the Acts of the Apostles, we have the idea of David having the Lord always before his eyes. And it's really, really wonderful that Matthew reworked this idea of David says concerning him, I foresaw the Lord always before my face. So in the Acts of the Apostles, David has the Lord always before his face. And so behave the Magi. Now they do not see the star on this somewhere on the sky. Now they see the star before them. The star goes before them, like the column of cloud or smoke in the wilderness. So we have here a beautiful illustration of the idea that is contained in both Psalm 16 and also which is quoted in the Acts of the Apostles, of having the Lord always before the face. And so the star leads them to Bethlehem. What happens later is the great joy, that they come and they see the sign and they have great joy. Why? Because also in the Acts of the Apostles there is the great joy. Therefore my heart rejoiced and my tongue was glad. Moreover, my flesh will rest in hope. And so on. The quotation from Psalm 16 referring to joy. And the beautiful thing is the gift that they give. In fact, they open their treasury repository, and they offer to Jesus 3 gifts, which is strange because in the Isaiah account, which lies behind it, we only have 2 gifts, gold and frankincense. Matthew makes 3 gifts here, and they bring these gifts to Jesus and the, say, church, 3-person church, I mean Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. They offer this money to the, say, nascent church in Bethlehem. Of course, we have the same idea in the Acts of the Apostles, that we have 3, but not 3 gifts, and not 3 magi, but 3,000 people who converted, 3,000 souls, and that is why we have 3 and not 2 gifts in the Matthean account. And this is the origin of the 3 gifts, and today we call them 3 kings, magi, and so on and so on, because we have 3,000 believers in the Acts of the Apostles. What do? They bring money to the apostles. So the same idea. We have 3,000 of the believers, and we have money given to them by them to the apostles. And here in the Gospel of Matthew, we have the same idea reworked in a beautiful way, that they gave money to Jesus and Mary and Joseph. So, such beautiful examples just to give you a flavor of my scholarship, of what I do in my scholarly work, how it really works, this Matthean use of the Acts of the Apostles. So we do not have quotations here. Like, why do we have 3 gifts? Because we have 3,000 people converted. I think that the Bible is generally made in this way. And it's not only the Gospels. It starts from the book of Genesis and it's go to the book of Revelation. The whole Bible is written in this way, with the use of such subtle hidden allusions. And we should be clever enough, intelligent enough to detect them. How is it possible to detect such allusions? Detecting one allusion is almost impossible because they are hidden. It's possible to detect them because they are put in a series. In fact, I detected around 500 such allusions, which are put in both works in the same order. And the sequence helps me to detect such allusions. With one allusion, I would always hesitate. Is it really an allusion? Is it maybe by chance? But if we have 500 such allusions, it's a big number, 500, put in the same order in the Gospel of Matthew as they can be found in the Acts of the Apostles, then we can detect them, and then I say that it is verifiable. Whereas the Q source is unverifiable because we have not seen it. Here we have the works, the written works, and we can always compare them, and we can always debate whether this is a real allusion or it's only my idea that we have an allusion here. But at least this is something tangible that we have, that we can touch and discuss and debate.
Matthew 3, 1-9, 34 as a sequential hypertextual reworking of Acts 8, 36, 12 to 25.
Mm-hmm. Just briefly, because we do not have time to discuss the whole gospel here. We already talked about the temptations, and I think it's also interesting to note that Matthew reordered the 2 last temptations. Maybe just to give you a hint of what happens in the Gospel of Matthew. The first temptation is the same that we have in the Gospel of Luke. So Matthew simply borrowed the first temptation account without changing anything. But then the second and third temptations are reordered in the Matthean Gospel. For what reason? We may have various ideas. Why did it happen, and so on and so on. I thought that maybe we have an ascending pattern here, going from the bottom to top. But we should also note the differences. And here, as I said before, we enter into another world, namely of changing things that could be previously found in the pre-existent text. I mean the text of Mark and the text of Luke. For example, in the Gospel of Luke, the third temptation takes place in a place that is high, somewhere high, on a high place. In the Matthean version of it, we have it not somewhere high, the second temptation, but it's in the city. And it's called Polis, the city. In the Lucan temptation, we have Jerusalem, the name of the city, Jerusalem. In the Matthean version, he did not copy the name of Jerusalem, but he made it only vaguely, refer to it as a city, simply. Because we have here, we are just already almost in the middle of the Acts of the Apostles, by the end of chapter 8, after the conversion of the Ethiopian eunuch. And we have the story of Philip, who goes first. He was found in Azotos. Azotos, in Greek, Azotos. Zoe means life. Azotos means a place without life. I haven't put it in my book, in my commentary, but it now came to my mind when I thought, what could we discuss today? Here we have the wilderness in Matthew. Wilderness is a place without life. It could also allude to this azotos, a non-living place in the Acts of the Apostles. It's Acts 8:40. Philippos the Heureta is azoton. Philip was found at Azotos. And passing through, he preached in all the cities, polis. So first we have cities, polis. And that is why in Matthew's version, first we have the second temptation, which takes place not in Jerusalem, but in a city. And the city is not named here. We only have the reference to a polis, to a city. And the third temptation is interesting because in the third temptation, in the Matthean version of it, we have a reference to the devil took him on an exceedingly high mountain and showed him all the kingdoms of the world and their glory. What are all the kingdoms of the world and their glory? At that time, we are in the 2nd century AD. All the kingdoms of the world, it was the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire ruled all the kingdoms of the world. It was the all-encompassing empire. And in fact, at the end of the story in the Acts of the Apostles, we have a reference to Caesarea, Caesarea, the city which was named after Caesar. So first we have polis, cities, and then we have a city named after Caesar. And I think that if we follow the sequence of the allusions from Matthew to the Acts of the Apostles, we have here the reason for changing the order of the temptations. Why did Matthew change the Lucan order of temptations? Because he first wanted to have a city, and then something referring to Caesar, to the empire. And that is why he first put the temptation in the city, not named Jerusalem, but simply the city, and then the temptation concerning all the kingdoms of the earth. So, such a problem like the order of temptation can be explained with the use of the recourse to the Acts of the Apostles. Then we come, after the temptations, then we come to the Sermon on the Mount. And here the introduction to the sermon is quite strange. That seeing the multitudes, he went up on the mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. We are used to this text, but we should ask a question. Where from? The disciples. Formerly in the Gospel, we only had 4 apostles called: Peter, Andrew, James, John. Now suddenly Jesus has some disciples who come to him on this high mountain. The high mountain, of course, alludes to the Mount Zion, in Jerusalem. And we have here Paul coming from afar, from Damascus to Jerusalem. And first, we have some distance because he cannot join the disciples. And that is why Jesus is first alone. And only later, the disciples come to him. And we have a similar story concerning Paul in Jerusalem, that first he was alone, and then he was admitted to be in the company of the disciples of Jesus in Jerusalem, in the Acts of the Apostles. So we have here, I think, an explanation of a phenomenon that is in itself quite strange, but it's not very striking. We should ask the question. Otherwise, if we don't ask the question, we simply read the Gospel and it seems obvious to us, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. We know this text by heart, and we do not ask questions. But Plato said that philosophy begins with wondering. Why? Why do we have disciples if they did not appear earlier in the Gospel? Why do we have disciples here? So if we ask a question, we become scholars. Why do we have disciples? With asking good questions, we become scholars. And I argue that we have an answer to this question. Why do we have disciples? Because they were already in Jerusalem, and Paul came to them and met them in Jerusalem. So, such little details, maybe somewhat earlier, sorry for skipping a little bit backwards in the previous statement, we have his fame went throughout all Syria, which is strange. Why? Why do we have such a broad perspective, including Syria? It's Matthew 4:24. Why do we have Syria suddenly here? In fact, Jesus does not go to any Syria. Why do we have suddenly Syria? Because in the preceding account in the Acts of the Apostles, we have Paul preaching in Damascus, which was the capital of Syria. So Paul's presence in Damascus explains Matthew's reference to Syria in his gospel. And so on and so on. We have some such minor details, I describe them in my commentary. Why do we have the great light? Because it was the illumination of Saul on his road to Damascus, and so on and so on. So if we compare the Acts of the Apostles with the corresponding sections of the Gospel of Matthew, then we have answers to such intriguing phenomena in the Gospel of Matthew. So my work does not only concern, just comparing Matthew with Acts, but it also explains a great number of things that can be found in the Matthean Gospel. And I think that this is the great heuristic value of my work, that I can explain the Gospel much better than was previously explained because of my recourses to the text here of the Acts of the Apostles that are proposed in my research. We can answer many questions that were without an adequate answer before, if we compare the Gospel of Matthew with the corresponding sections of the Acts of the Apostles.
Let's take a look at the next one.
Actually, I will just give another example, because maybe you just follow the order of my chapters. But in fact, the chapters here are more or less artificial. I will give another example that I like really very much. After the Sermon on the Mount, we have here the story that is, really beautiful. It's Matthew 8:19. Somewhat earlier, 8:18, when Jesus saw great multitudes about him, he gave a command to depart to the other side. We know it from the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, we have this pattern of first preparing a boat, then being in the boat close to the shore, and then going in the boat to the other side. We have 3 steps of this travel of Jesus to the other side, to the Gentile side of the Lake of Galilee, which Mark calls Talas, the sea. In this way, Mark described Jesus' outreach to the Gentiles. And here Matthew uses this motif, but he uses it in a very strange way. Namely, when Jesus saw a great multitude or great multitudes, here on Auckland Rialton, it's in singular in fact, he ordered to go to the other side. And now we would expect something about going to the other side, to the pagan Gentile side of the Lake of Galilee. Instead of this, instead of having the continuation of the story of going to the other side of the sea, which we find a little bit later in 8:23, when they got into the boat, his disciples followed him, and so on and so on. We have something inserted here. Surprising. What do we have here? Then a certain scribe came and said to him, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." It is strange, because Jesus wants to go to the other side of the sea. And suddenly a grammateus, which in the Gospels means a Jewish scribe, a Jewish teacher of the law, expert in the law, better to say, now approached Jesus on his way to the Gentiles. Which is strange in fact. Why do we interrupt the travel to the other side, to the Gentile side of the sea, and insert here a story which is taken from quite different place in the Gospel of Luke, and inserted here into the Gospel of Mark, into another context. In fact, it's out of context here. A Jewish expert in the law wanting to be together with Jesus. Because in the corresponding section of the Acts of the Apostles, it's 11:19. We have a similar outreach to the Gentiles. Now those who were scattered after the persecution that arose over Stephen traveled as far as Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. You could walk to Phoenicia, you could walk to Antioch, but you needed a ship to go to Cyprus. You need to sail to Cyprus. So we have the idea of sailing at least to Cyprus, maybe also to Phoenicia and Antioch, because it was much easier to go by sea there than to go by land. So we have the idea of sailing to Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. But then suddenly, Luke remarks, preaching the word to no one but the Jews only. So we have a contrast here. On the one hand, we go to the Gentiles in Phoenicia, Cyprus, and Antioch. On the other hand, Luke adds here at the beginning, lalon teston logon eime monon Judaios. Medeni lalon teston logon eime monon Judaios. But they were preaching the word to no one except the Jews. And this is the reason for the Matthean surprising insertion of the Jewish expert in the law. Jesus wants to go to the Gentiles, on the other hand, the side of the sea, but a certain Jewish expert in the law comes here and asks him what should he do, and so on and so on, that he wants to travel with Jesus, and so on. So it's such a striking element, of putting a fragment of the Gospel of Luke into another context, of the Gospel of Mark, relocating the Lucan text to a strange place, can be explained by the recourse to the idea taken from the Acts of the Apostles. I don't know how much time do we have here.
Well, we've gone through most of the slides. The final.
Maybe let's come to the end of the Gospel, because we do not have enough time. We were already over more than 1 hour here.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah, no problem.
Let's come to the end, because in the Passion narrative, we also have some beautiful elements which betray Matthew's reworking of the Acts of the Apostles. One of the reviewers of my book that we discuss here wrote that for him, this element is really, really persuasive. If we could doubt other elements, other allusions, and so on, he wrote that this is really persuasive to him. Namely, a minor element, the presence of the wife of the Roman prefect, procurator of Judea. We only have it in the Acts of the Apostles, Drusilla, the wife of Felix, and we also have it in the Gospel of Matthew. Suddenly, the wife of Pilate appears here. It's only in the Gospel of Matthew. No other Gospel has any mention concerning the wife of Pilate. Normally, it's the Pilate, that the procurator, who is active here. And suddenly, the wife of Pilate appears here. Moreover, her role is also quite interesting. What does she do in this story? She says, it's chapter 90. It's chapter 27, verse 19. Matthew 27, verse 19. While he was sitting on the judgment seat, his wife sent to him, saying, "Have nothing to do with that just man, Dikaios." So suddenly, unexpectedly, the wife of Pilate appears in the story for no reason, and he calls Jesus Dikaios, just, a righteous one. How does she know Jesus at all? How does she know that Jesus is righteous, that he is just? In fact, we do not have this epithet applied to Jesus earlier in the Gospel. We can say various things about Jesus, but not necessarily that he is just, that he is righteous. But here she refers to him as dikaios, as righteous. If we go to the Acts of the Apostles, we have a corresponding section of the trial of Paul in Jerusalem. Here, Jesus stands for Paul from the Acts of the Apostles. We have also the wife of the Roman procurator. It's 44, verse 44. Sorry, not 40. 24, verse 24. Chapter 24, verse 24. And after some days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, who was Jewish, we have a Jewish wife, the Roman procurator, which could explain the, say, Jewish interests of the wife Pilate in the Matthean Gospel. He sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ. Now, as he reasoned about righteousness, dikaiosina, self-control and the judgment to come, krimatos to mellontos, Felix was afraid and answered, "Go away for now. When I have a convenient time, I will call for you." So what was the topic of their talk, of their discussion? It was righteousness, dikaiosina, and krateia, and also krima, judgment. So out of the three words used here, the first and the third are clearly legal. Righteousness and judgment, krima, dikaiosina and krima. So I think that, in fact, even linguistically, Matthew alludes to this fragment of the Acts of the Apostles. In fact, in the Gospel, we do not have Paul on trial. Of course, we have Jesus on trial, but we also have the wife of the Roman prefect, procurator, who says that Jesus is an expert in justice, in righteousness. He is a righteous man, dikaios. He uses the same word that we have here in the Acts of the Apostles. So I think it's a beautiful example of Matthew's use of the Acts of the Apostles, because this element cannot be found in Mark, in Luke, even in the Gospel of John. So it's only contained in the Gospel of Matthew and also in the Acts of the Apostles, the motif of the Jewish wife of the Roman procurator.
Well, thanks for joining me once again, Dr. Adamczewski. And I thank everybody for their continued support of my channel and everyone else that participated in the live chat. And I will see all of you later.
So I think that we had a good talk here concerning the Gospel of Matthew. I simply refer you to my book and also my articles, because we cannot explain here everything on the podcast on this channel. Especially, as you can see, these are details, especially in the original. Also changing some things, changing the order of things, changing prepositions, changing words. So we should come to details here, and we are not able to do it here without text before our eyes, without comparing text in detail and so on. So I simply refer you to my publications, but I think that, admitting for such a thing that Matthew could use not only the Gospel of Luke, as it's argued by my colleagues who also opt for Matthean posteriority, but I say, if he used Luke, then why not Acts? It's the 2-volume work. So if Matthew used Luke, then he must have known Acts as well. What was his reaction to Acts? I think that he took Acts and he reworked it word after word, sentence after sentence, in his own Gospel in a very creative way. So thank you very much for your attention and for participation in this interesting talk.
Thanks again, Professor. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.